There is a feeling you may know well, not the ordinary tiredness that comes from a long day, something quieter, something deeper, a slow, persistent sense that you are living at a fraction of your real capacity, that the version of you showing up each morning is somehow smaller than the version waiting inside you, that there is a level of clarity, of peace, of power that others seem to access, and you have never quite found the door. But what if that feeling is not a sign that something is wrong with you? What if it is the most intelligent signal your inner world has ever sent? What if your own consciousness is already telling you it is ready to expand? Today, you are going to receive a map, a complete map of the 7 levels of consciousness, the hidden architecture of your own mind, and the precise principles that will allow you to move deliberately and permanently into the levels where life is no longer something that happens to you, but something that flows through you. We exist beneath an illusion, the illusion that we all share one single solid reality. But the deeper truth is this: there are infinite worlds coexisting within the same space and time. The difference between a life of suffering and a life of wholeness does not live in your external circumstances. It lives in the level of consciousness from which you are perceiving life. Think of consciousness as a grand 7-story building. The overwhelming majority of humanity is born, lives, and leaves this world from the basement. From that position, the view is severely limited. The walls feel solid and immovable. Fear becomes the air you breathe, and you begin to believe that life is a constant battle against scarcity, against others, against circumstance itself. And yet, even in the darkest basement, light finds the cracks. There comes a moment when the pain of staying finally exceeds the fear of leaving, when the suffering becomes so loud it breaks its own container. And in that moment, the soul speaks with absolute clarity. There must be another way. That question, there must be another way, is the first fracture in the prison wall. The first step out of victim consciousness is not a complex ritual. It is a single, devastating, liberating choice to assume 100% responsibility for your life experience. Not blame directed inward, not control of all external events, but the recognition that you have the power to choose your perception, your interpretation, and your response to anything life places before you. The victim asks, "Why is this happening to me?" The awakening creator asks, "What is this situation inviting me to learn?" That shift in the question changes everything. Because there comes a moment in every awakening life when the basement becomes unbearable, when the victim's story collapses under its own weight, when the pain of powerlessness finally pushes the soul upward towards something fiercer, something hungrier, something that refuses to stay small. This is the second level, the consciousness of struggle, the warrior. And it is important to understand from the very beginning, this level is not a mistake. It is not a detour. It is a monumental and necessary evolution. It is the first great awakening of the human spirit. Because at this level, something fundamental shifts. Life ceases to be something that happens to you and becomes something you can make happen. You stop being the effect. You begin to act as the cause. You remove the posture of the victim and put on the armor of the warrior. The world no longer looks like a place of random chaos and arbitrary punishment. It transforms into a battlefield, a vast strategic arena populated by challenges and opportunities. Obstacles are no longer interpreted as cruelty from fate. They are adversaries to be defeated. Goals are no longer distant dreams. They are territories to be conquered. And this new perception is enormously empowering. The helplessness of the basement is replaced by a commanding sense of agency. The warrior discovers willpower, and he develops it deliberately, like a muscle trained through daily resistance. He learns to rise early when every cell in his body demands rest.
He learns to make the difficult decision when fear pulses through him. He learns to say no to the immediate reward in order to say yes to the long-term vision. He builds discipline into the architecture of his days, and through that discipline, he begins to sculpt his own reality. The emotional landscape of this level is intense, charged, and kinetic. The dominant force driving the warrior is ambition, the fire of desire to expand, to accomplish, to win, to demonstrate what he is capable of. It lifts him out of passivity and launches him into full engagement with the world. When the world resists him, he does not lament, he ignites. He takes that friction and uses it as fuel, redoubling his efforts, attacking the obstacle with greater force. And we should not diminish what this level produces in the world. The warrior is the hero archetype of our civilization. The entrepreneurs who build companies from nothing, the athletes who redefine the limits of human performance, the leaders who construct institutions that outlast them. They are frequently the most respected and admired members of society. They have mastered significant dimensions of the material world. And from the perspective of the basement, the second floor looks like a palace. But here is the truth that the warrior eventually discovers, usually through exhaustion, through burnout, through a quiet moment of devastating honesty with himself. Despite every achievement, despite every summit reached, the satisfaction never fully arrives. He wins the battle, and before he can rest, the next battle has already appeared on the horizon. His peace is always conditional, always temporary, always shadowed by the anxiety of what comes next. His sense of worth is completely fused with his performance. He is his results. When he wins, he's a winner. When he fails, even briefly, even privately, he's a failure. His self-regard is not intrinsic, it is a reflection of his output. And so he lives under relentless, unforgiving pressure to prove his value again and again and again, to the world and more painfully to himself. His fundamental worldview remains deeply dualistic, me against the world. He has not yet encountered the intelligence of surrender. He has not yet discovered what becomes available when striving gives way to flow, when individual will makes contact with something larger than itself. The warrior knows how to push. He has not yet learned how to receive. At the physiological level, living in struggle consciousness is living in a state of chronic activation, the fight or flight response, designed by nature for short, urgent moments of survival, elevated into a permanent lifestyle. The body runs on adrenaline and cortisol. The inner orchestra plays a constant fanfare of tension, and over time, the consequences become unavoidable. Chronic exhaustion, immune systems that quietly weaken, sleep that never fully restores, a nervous system wound so tight it has forgotten what stillness feels like. This is the sacred disease of the warrior. He is simultaneously wired and depleted. He cannot stop because stopping feels like losing, but he cannot continue indefinitely because the body is not a machine and it will eventually insist on being heard. There is also a subtler shadow at this level, because the warrior's relationship with others is filtered through the same competitive lens he applies to everything. He evaluates people in terms of strength or weakness, usefulness or threat. Collaboration is tolerated when strategically necessary, but deep trust remains elusive. Vulnerability is perceived as dangerous, a crack in the armor that an adversary might exploit. And so he remains alone at the center of his battlefield, powerful, admired, and profoundly isolated. The awakening from warrior consciousness does not come through failure alone, though failure often catalyzes it. It comes through a more specific kind of crisis, the achievement of a long-pursued goal, followed by an unexpected emptiness. The warrior reaches the summit he spent years climbing. He stands there, breathless, victorious, and then he notices the feeling he expected to find at the top is not there. Or it is there, but only for a moment, and then it fades, and the mountain is replaced by another mountain, and he realizes with a kind of quiet devastation that he has been playing a game that cannot be won, not because victory is impossible, but because victory at this level was never the real destination. This realization is not a defeat, it is an initiation. It is the warrior beginning to suspect that the enemy he was fighting was always, at its deepest level, an internal one, that the enemy was never out there, that the power he was struggling to prove was already his, that there is a way of being in the world that does not require constant battle to sustain itself. This suspicion, quiet at first, then increasingly undeniable, is the first light of the third floor beginning to filter through the ceiling of the second. The shift from warrior consciousness to what lies above it is not a weakening, it is not a retreat from power. It is the discovery of a different and far more sophisticated relationship with power, one that does not require force to exist, one that does not depend on external victory to be felt, one that flows rather than pushes, that creates rather than conquers. The warrior has done extraordinary work. He has broken free from victimhood. He has built real capacity in the world. He has proven beyond any doubt that he is not helpless. Now, the invitation is to lay down the armor, not in surrender, but in trust, to discover what he is when he is no longer fighting to become something. The staircase continues upward, and what waits on the next floor will ask something of you that neither the victim nor the warrior ever learned how to do, to stop, to turn inward, and to truly listen.
There comes a moment in the life of every warrior when the battlefield grows quiet. Not because the war has ended, but because something deep within him stops believing in the war itself. The victories feel hollow. The goals, once conquered, reveal only the outline of the next goal waiting behind them. And in that strange, uncomfortable silence, a new question surfaces, one that no amount of achievement has ever been able to answer. Who am I beneath all of this? This question is not a sign of weakness. It is not burnout dressed in philosophical clothing. It is the soul beginning to remember something it knew before the armor was put on, before the scoreboard was erected, before the world told you what success was supposed to look like and you agreed to spend your life pursuing it. This is the third level of consciousness, the seeker. And the seeker is born precisely in that gap, the gap between what was promised and what was delivered, between the life that was built according to every external instruction and the feeling, persistent and impossible to silence, that something essential is still missing. At this level, the direction of attention reverses for the first time. The victim looked outward to assign blame. The warrior looked outward to conquer. The seeker turns inward. Not in retreat, not in defeat, but in genuine, courageous curiosity. He begins to ask questions that have no immediate practical application, questions that cannot be optimized or monetized, questions that simply demand to be sat with in the quiet. What is the nature of my own mind? Why do I react the way I react? What am I actually seeking beneath every goal I have ever pursued? Is the self I present to the world the self I actually am? And if not, who is the one beneath it? These questions mark the beginning of what might be called the inner journey. And it is, without any exaggeration, the most important journey a human being can undertake. Because every external journey, every mountain climbed, every fortune accumulated, every relationship formed is ultimately a projection of the inner landscape. Change the landscape within, and the world outside transforms, without force, without struggle, without the exhausting effort of trying to control what was never yours to control. The seeker begins to read, to explore, to seek teachers, philosophies, traditions that offer maps of the inner world. He discovers meditation and begins to observe the mind rather than simply inhabiting it. He encounters spiritual teachings, psychological frameworks, ancient wisdom traditions, and something in him recognizes them not as new information, but as remembered truth. As if he always knew this somewhere beneath the noise, and the words are simply clearing the debris to reveal what was always present. This is one of the most beautiful dimensions of this level, the experience of recognition, of reading a sentence and feeling something unlock in the chest, of hearing a teaching and thinking, yes, that is it, that is what I have always felt but never had the language for. The dominant emotional quality of seeker consciousness is a mixture of wonder and restlessness. Wonder because the inner world, once discovered, is vast and astonishing and endlessly rich, and restlessness because the seeker now lives between two worlds. He has seen enough to know that the basement and the battlefield are insufficient, but he has not yet arrived at the stable ground of the higher floors. He is in motion, in transition, in the sacred uncertainty of genuine transformation. This in-between state carries its own particular discomfort. The seeker often finds that his former social world no longer fits the way it once did. Conversations that previously felt natural now feel shallow. Relationships built on shared complaints or competitive comparison begin to feel hollow. He begins to need something different: depth, authenticity, genuine exchange. And finding those things is not always easy. The seeker can feel profoundly alone, even surrounded by people who care for him. There is also a specific shadow that belongs to this level, a trap so subtle and so seductive that many seekers spend years inside it without recognizing its walls. It is the trap of perpetual seeking itself. The accumulation of knowledge, teachings, practices, and frameworks as a substitute for the actual transformation they point toward. The seeker becomes a collector of maps, but never makes the journey the maps describe. He reads every book on meditation, but sits in practice for only minutes at a time before reaching for another book. He attends retreats, workshops, seminars, and feels the familiar rush of recognition, of opening, of possibility, and then returns to ordinary life and wonders why nothing has fundamentally changed. He follows teachers across the world, but deflects the teaching the moment it points at something he is not yet ready to confront in himself. This is spiritual bypassing, using the vocabulary and the aesthetic of awakening to avoid the actual uncomfortable, unglamorous work of transformation. And it is one of the most common ways genuine evolution stalls at the third level. The seeker must eventually confront a humbling truth. Understanding is not transformation. Insight without integration is simply sophisticated entertainment. The map is not the territory, and no amount of knowledge about the nature of consciousness will substitute for the direct, lived experience of shifting it. The genuine seeker, the one who moves through this level and continues to ascend, is the one who learns to apply what he finds, who takes the insight from the book and tests it in the moment of anger, who takes the teaching from the retreat and brings it into the difficult conversation he has been avoiding, who discovers that real spiritual practice is not what happens on the meditation cushion, it is what happens the moment he steps off it. He also learns to develop discernment, because the seeking journey, if pursued without careful attention, can lead into territories that deepen confusion rather than clarity. There are teachings that liberate and teachings that bind. There are teachers who genuinely point beyond themselves and teachers who, conscious or not, cultivate dependency. The seeker learns to feel the difference. He learns to trust his own direct experience as the final arbiter of truth,
not the authority of any external source, however eloquent or credentialed. One of the most significant thresholds of this level is the moment the seeker stops looking for a teacher to give him the answer and begins to trust the quiet voice within him that already knows. This is not arrogance. It is the first genuine contact with inner authority, with the understanding that the wisdom he has been searching for in books, teachers, and traditions was always present within him, waiting patiently beneath the noise of the unexamined mind. And when that contact is made, when the seeker sits in genuine stillness and for the first time hears something from within himself that is not the voice of fear or ambition or habit, but something deeper, something steady, something that has been there all along, something irrevocable shifts. He realizes he was never lost. He was simply looking in the wrong direction. The fourth floor is not found through more seeking. It is found through a quality that the warrior suppressed and the victim never discovered. A quality that requires more courage than any battle ever demanded. The willingness to be completely, radically, uncomfortably still. And in that stillness, to encounter yourself. Not the self you have constructed, not the self you perform for the world, but the self that exists before it all.
There is a moment that changes everything. It does not arrive with thunder. It does not announce itself with ceremony or spectacle. It comes quietly, almost gently, like the first light of a dawn you did not know you had been waiting for your entire life. It is the moment you realize, for the very first time with absolute clarity, that you are not your thoughts. This is the fourth level of consciousness, the witness. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most profound thresholds a human being can cross, because everything that came before, the victimhood, the struggle, the seeking, was lived from inside the mind, identified completely with its contents, believing every thought that arose, treating every emotion as an undeniable report on the nature of reality, swimming in the current without ever realizing there was a riverbank from which the current could be observed. The witness steps onto that bank. Not through force, not through more effort or more seeking, but through a quality that all the previous levels were inadvertently preparing for, the capacity for pure, non-judgmental awareness, the ability to observe the mind without being consumed by it, to watch a thought arise and recognize it as a thought, to feel an emotion move through and recognize it as a movement of energy, not as the truth of who you are, not as a command that must be obeyed, but as a temporary event occurring within a field of awareness that is itself untouched, unchanged, and undisturbed. This shift in identity is the revolution. Not a revolution in your circumstances, not a revolution in what you do or what you own or how others perceive you, a revolution in what you understand yourself to be. You are not the content of the mind. You are the space in which that content appears. You are not the weather. You are the sky. The ancient traditions have always pointed to this. The Zen masters spoke of it. The great sages of India mapped it with extraordinary precision. The mystics of every lineage, regardless of the cultural costume they wore, were gesturing at this same fundamental recognition, that beneath the personality, beneath the stories, beneath the accumulated identities of a lifetime, there is a presence, still, aware, complete, unthreatened by any experience, unchanged by any circumstance, and that presence is what you actually are. At the level of the witness, the relationship with thought undergoes a complete transformation. The victim believed every thought and suffered them as reality. The warrior selected thoughts strategically and wielded them as weapons. The seeker examined thoughts with curiosity and sought to replace limiting ones with more empowering alternatives.
The witness does something different entirely. He simply watches, without preference, without the urgency to fix, suppress, or amplify. He observes the thought arise, linger, and dissolve, and he remains undisturbed. This is not indifference. It is not detachment in the cold, disconnected sense that word sometimes implies. It is something far subtler and far more alive. It is presence without reactivity, awareness without agenda, the mind in its natural state before conditioning taught it to be at war with its own contents. The practical consequences of this shift are profound and immediate. When you are no longer identified with every thought and emotion, the grip of suffering loosens. Not because suffering never arises, it does. Pain is a natural feature of human experience. But the difference between pain and suffering is the story the mind builds around pain, the interpretations, the extensions, the catastrophic futures it projects from a single moment of discomfort. The witness interrupts that process at its source. He sees the pain. He does not add the story. And without the story, the pain moves through, as all things move through, rather than calcifying into a chronic internal condition. Anxiety is experienced differently at this level. Fear still arises. The witness is not a robot, not a stone, not a disconnected observer floating above the human experience. But fear is recognized as a movement of energy in the body, arising in response to a thought about a future that has not yet occurred. And when it is seen clearly, when it is witnessed rather than inhabited, its power to commandeer the entire system is dramatically reduced. You can be afraid and remain free. You can feel anger and not become it. You can experience grief and not be destroyed by it, because you are larger than all of it. The emotional landscape of witness consciousness is characterized by an equanimity that those at lower levels sometimes misinterpret as coldness. It is not coldness, it is depth. It is the peace that does not depend on external conditions remaining favorable, the stillness that is not the absence of movement, but the ground beneath all movement. The witness can be fully present in joy without grasping, fully present in difficulty without collapsing. He has found the still point at the center of the turning world. There is also a shadow at this level, a subtle and seductive danger that must be named honestly. It is possible to use the witness state as a sophisticated form of withdrawal from life, to observe so completely that engagement is replaced by detachment, to watch the river of experience from the bank and never step into the water, to use awareness as a kind of armor, to become so identified with the role of the observer that the full, messy, vulnerable, gloriously imperfect participation in human life is quietly abandoned. This is witness consciousness becoming an escape rather than a foundation, and the invitation of the fourth floor is to understand that witnessing is not the destination. It is the necessary ground from which the higher levels of consciousness become possible. The bank is not meant to be a permanent residence. It is meant to be the stable place from which you can choose, freely and consciously, when and how to enter the water. The witness also begins to encounter something deeply unsettling and deeply liberating at the same time, the recognition of how much of what he previously called himself was never truly his, the opinions inherited from his upbringing, the fears absorbed from his culture, the self-image constructed from a handful of childhood experiences that were interpreted by a child's limited understanding and then carried, unexamined, into adult life, the identities assembled from the expectations of others and then defended for decades as though they were sacred. When all of this is seen clearly, when the witness observes the machinery of the conditioned self with honest, non-judgmental attention, there is initially a kind of grief, the grief of recognizing how long the performance has been running, how much energy has been spent maintaining a self-concept that was never more than a collection of borrowed beliefs, How many choices were made not from genuine freedom, but from the automatic execution of unconscious programming? And then, beneath that grief, something else, something vast and clean and quietly extraordinary. The recognition that if all that was constructed, then it can be reconstructed. That the self is not a fixed object inherited at birth and carried unchanged to the grave. It is a living process, a dynamic creative act, and the witness, in seeing the process clearly, gains the extraordinary capacity to participate in it consciously rather than suffering it unconsciously. This is the threshold of genuine freedom, not the freedom of the warrior, who is free from external oppression but enslaved to his own reactivity, not the freedom of the seeker, who is free from ignorance but still searching for solid ground, but the freedom of one who has found the ground within himself, who has discovered the unchanging presence beneath the changing contents of experience, who knows not as a concept but as a living reality that whatever arises, he will remain. From this foundation, the higher levels of consciousness become not just possible, but natural, because the obstacle that blocked them was never circumstance, it was never lack of effort, it was identification, the mistaken belief that you were the contents of the mind, rather than the awareness in which that content arises. That belief now has been seen through, and what remains when identification falls away is something that the lower levels of consciousness could only imagine, something that cannot be adequately described in language, only pointed at and then recognized in the silence between the words. The fifth floor is waiting, and what it asks of you is not more observation. It is something the mind, for all its sophistication, cannot manufacture on its own. It can only be opened to. It can only be allowed.
There is something the mind cannot manufacture. It is tried across centuries of human civilization with extraordinary sophistication and relentless ingenuity. It has built philosophies and systems and theologies and psychological frameworks, all reaching toward the same destination through the instrument of thought. And all of them, at their outermost edge, arrive at the same honest confession, that the thing they were reaching for cannot be reached by reaching at all. It can only be open to. This is the fifth level of consciousness, the heart, the level of love, of genuine compassion, of a connection so deep and so fundamental that it dissolves the boundary the mind spent a lifetime constructing, the boundary between self and other. To understand what this level truly means, we must first clear away what it does not mean, because the word love has been so thoroughly saturated with misuse, with sentimentality, with the transactional dynamics of the lower levels, that it requires careful restoration before it can point at something real. The love of the lower levels is conditional. It is an emotion that arises when certain conditions are met and withdraws when they are not. When someone behaves as we wish, we feel affection. When they disappoint us, the affection contracts. This is not love in the sense of the fifth level. This is preference dressed in love's clothing. It is attachment, the warrior's possessiveness, the victim's need for external validation, wearing a more socially acceptable name. The love that characterizes the fifth level of consciousness is not an emotion that arises and subsides. It is a perception, a fundamental way of seeing, a recognition as immediate and as undeniable as the recognition of light, that the life looking out through your eyes is the same life looking out through every other pair of eyes you will ever encounter. That the separation the mind insists upon, the iron boundary between I and other, is a functional fiction, useful at the level of the body and the personality, but not ultimately real. When this recognition moves from intellectual concept into lived experience, when it is felt in the body, not merely understood by the mind, something in the human being opens that cannot be closed again.
Not the opening of a door, but the dissolving of a wall that was never as solid as it appeared. The witness at the fourth level discovered that he was not his thoughts. The heart discovers something still more astonishing, that the awareness he discovered in himself is not his alone, that the same presence he encountered in the stillness of his own interior is the presence animating everything he sees. The tree outside the window, the stranger on the street, the enemy he spent years constructing and defending himself against. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is not a comforting spiritual narrative designed to make people feel better about the difficulties of existence. It is a direct report from those who have genuinely inhabited this level, across every culture, every tradition, every century of recorded human experience, that at the level of pure awareness, the distinction between self and other becomes not meaningless, but transparent. It is still there, but it is seen through. And what is seen through it is a fundamental unity that the conceptual mind can only gesture at, and the heart, in its deepest opening, actually touches. The practical consequences of living from this level are extraordinary, because when the other is no longer fundamentally separate from you, the entire architecture of relating is transformed. Judgment does not disappear. Discernment remains, and remains necessary. But the harsh, contracted, self-protective quality of judgment softens into something more spacious. You can see clearly that someone is operating from fear, from conditioning, from the limited perception of a lower level, and you can see it without contempt, because you remember those floors, because you know from the inside what it feels like to be imprisoned in the basement, because compassion is simply the natural response of someone who has suffered and remembers to someone who is suffering now. Compassion at this level is not pity. Pity looks down. Compassion looks across. Pity maintains the distance between the one who is whole and the one who is broken. Compassion recognizes that wholeness and brokenness are not opposites. They are different moments in the same human journey. And it responds not from superiority, but from solidarity, from the recognition that the suffering in front of you is not foreign. It is familiar, it is human, and you are human too. The emotional climate of the fifth level is characterized by a warmth that radiates without effort, not performed warmth, the smile maintained by social obligation, the kindness deployed strategically to produce a desired impression, but the natural warmth of a system that is no longer primarily organized around self-protection. When the defensive structures of the lower levels begin to relax, when the walls built to keep threat out are gradually recognized as walls that also keep connection out, a natural openness emerges. And in that openness, genuine intimacy becomes possible, not just in romantic relationships, but in every human encounter. The conversation with a colleague, the interaction with a stranger, the difficult exchange with someone whose worldview is entirely different from your own. There is a shadow here too, because the heart's openness, if not grounded in the witness's clarity, can become a vulnerability that is not sustainable. The person who opens without discernment absorbs the suffering of everyone around them and loses themselves in it. They confuse boundaries with barriers and dismantle the first along with the second. They give from depletion rather than from abundance and call the exhaustion that follows spiritual generosity. This is compassion without wisdom, and it eventually collapses, leaving the person more contracted and defended than before. The fifth level at its fullest is the integration of the witness's clarity and the heart's openness, seeing clearly and loving fully, being present to the suffering of others without being destroyed by it, maintaining the still point of inner awareness while allowing the heart to be genuinely moved. This is what the traditions call compassionate wisdom, and it is rarer and more extraordinary than either quality alone. At this level, the nature of service also transforms completely. The warrior served, when he served at all, because service demonstrated his strength, his value, his superiority. The seeker served because the teaching said he should. The heart serves because it cannot do otherwise. Because when the boundary between self and other becomes transparent, the suffering of another is not a distant abstraction that triggers intellectual concern. It is felt directly, in the body, in the chest, in the very center of awareness. And the response is not calculated. It is immediate, organic, as natural as pulling your hand from a flame. This is the level from which the world's greatest humanitarians have operated. Not all of them used spiritual language. Not all of them would have recognized themselves in the framework being offered here. But the common thread across cultures, centuries, and circumstances is this quality of seeing the other as genuinely mattering, not as a concept, not as a duty, but as a reality as vivid and as undeniable as one's own existence. Something else becomes available at the fifth level that was entirely inaccessible below it, a quality of receiving. Because the lower levels were organized primarily around taking, acquiring safety, acquiring power, acquiring knowledge, acquiring experience, the fifth level discovers that life also gives, constantly, abundantly, in ways that the defended, contracted, self-protective lower levels could never perceive because they were always braced against what was coming next. Gratitude at this level is not a practice performed in the morning before the day begins. It is a continuous recognition of the extraordinary improbability and beauty of existence itself, that you are here, that you are aware, that there is something rather than nothing, that the morning light exists and falls on your face and you have the astonishing capacity to feel it. These are not small things dressed up in spiritual language. They are, when truly seen, overwhelming in their magnificence, and the heart that is genuinely opened cannot encounter them without being moved. The sixth floor will ask for something that even the opened heart finds difficult. It will ask for you to bring everything you have discovered, the clarity of the witness, the openness of the heart, into your actual lived experience, into the texture of your daily existence, not just in the moments of stillness and beauty, but in the chaos and contradiction and magnificent difficulty of being fully, unreservedly, courageously alive.
There is a question that arrives at a certain point in the inner journey, not as an abstract philosophical inquiry, but as a living, urgent, deeply personal demand. It arrives when the stillness of the witness and the openness of the heart have been genuinely tasted, when the inner landscape has been transformed in ways that are real and undeniable, and yet the outer life still carries the fingerprints of the old levels. When the gap between who you are becoming on the inside and how you are living on the outside becomes impossible to ignore. The question is this: if consciousness shapes reality, if the level from which I perceive the world determines the world I perceive, then what am I actually creating? And am I creating it consciously? This is the sixth level of consciousness, the conscious creator. And it represents the most practical, the most tangible, the most immediately applicable level of the entire ascent. Because while the previous levels were primarily concerned with inner transformation, with changing the perceiver, the sixth level brings that transformation into direct, deliberate contact with the outer world. It is the level at which the inner and the outer are understood not as separate domains, but as a single unified field, where the landscape of consciousness and the landscape of life are recognized as mirror images of each other, and where the extraordinary implication of that recognition is fully embraced. You are not merely an observer of your life, you are its author. This is not the warrior's version of authorship, the brute force imposition of will upon matter through relentless effort and control. The conscious creator has moved far beyond that. He has discovered something the warrior never suspected, that the deepest creative power available to a human being is not located in the muscles of willpower or the strategies of the intellect. It is located in the quality of consciousness itself, in the vibrational state, the emotional, mental, and energetic signature that a person is consistently broadcasting from the interior of their being. Every thought held with sustained attention and emotional charge is a creative act. Every belief operating beneath the level of conscious awareness is shaping the filter through which reality is perceived, and therefore the reality that is experienced. Every emotional state maintained as a chronic condition is sending a signal into the field of possibility, and that field responds, not randomly, not arbitrarily, but with the precise and indifferent intelligence of a mirror. This is not magical thinking. It is not a denial of practical action or external circumstance. It is the recognition, supported by both ancient wisdom and the emerging edges of modern understanding, that the inner state of the observer is never separate from what the observer observes. That what we bring to any situation, the quality of presence, the depth of belief, the emotional frequency we are operating from, shapes what that situation becomes and what it delivers back to us. The conscious creator works with this understanding not as a theory to be believed, but as a living laboratory to be explored. He begins to observe the relationship between his inner states and his outer experiences with the same rigor and honesty that a scientist brings to the study of natural phenomena. He notices that when he operates from fear, even while taking all the correct external actions, the results consistently reflect the frequency of fear. Contraction, resistance, the very outcome that was most dreaded, finding its way through. And he notices that when he operates from clarity, from genuine confidence, from the expansive emotional state of someone who already understands themselves to be capable and worthy, the same external actions produce dramatically different results. Doors opened that were previously sealed. Conversations shift in directions that could not have been planned. Opportunities appeared that were invisible from the contracted frequency of the lower levels, not because the world has changed, but because the perceiver has. The primary instrument of the conscious creator is intention, not the pale, tentative, vaguely hopeful wishing that most people mistake for intention, but clear, fully committed, emotionally embodied intention. The kind that does not leave room for the quiet background voice of doubt that undermines the signal before it has left the building. The kind that is not simply stated, but felt, inhabiting the body, saturating the nervous system, animating every cell with the living reality of what is being called forth. This requires a level of self-knowledge that the lower levels never developed, because you cannot set a genuine intention while simultaneously holding a belief that contradicts it. You cannot call forth abundance while a deep subterranean conviction of unworthiness is running its quiet counterprogram beneath the surface. The conscious creator therefore develops the practice of radical inner honesty, of identifying the beliefs that operate in the shadows, the inherited convictions about what is possible for someone like him, about whether he deserves what he is asking for, about whether the universe is fundamentally trustworthy or fundamentally hostile. These shadow beliefs are the invisible architecture of the life that has been created thus far. They are the programming that was installed in childhood, reinforced by experience, and then forgotten at the conscious level, where they continued to run, silently and efficiently, producing results that seemed inexplicable from the outside, but were entirely logical from the inside. The conscious creator brings them into the light, not to condemn them, not to engage in a new form of inner warfare, but to see them clearly, and in seeing them clearly, to dissolve their authority. Because a belief, once fully seen, loses its power to operate unconsciously. It becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. And the conscious creator is above all else someone who has reclaimed the power to choose, not just in the gross, obvious decisions of daily life, what to eat, where to work, who to spend time with, but in the subtler, more fundamental choices that those decisions emerge from, the choice of what to believe, the choice of what to expect, the choice of what emotional state to cultivate as the ground from which action arises.
The relationship with time also transforms at this level. The lower levels were imprisoned by time in different ways. The victim was trapped in the past, in the story of what had been done to him, what had been taken, what had gone wrong. The warrior was enslaved to the future, always oriented toward the next goal, the next conquest, the horizon that kept receding as he advanced. The seeker moved between past and future, excavating old wounds for understanding, projecting ideal futures as motivation. The conscious creator inhabits the present, not as a spiritual platitude, but as a practical creative strategy, because the present moment is the only point in time where intention can be set, where energy can be directed, where the creative act can actually occur. The past is a fixed record, the future is a field of probability, and the only instrument available for shaping that field is the quality of consciousness brought to this moment, right now, this breath, this choice, this internal state being cultivated or allowed to persist in this instant. This transforms the experience of waiting, of the inevitable gap between intention and manifestation, from a period of anxiety and doubt into a period of continued creative alignment. The conscious creator understands that doubt during the gap is not merely an emotional discomfort, it is a counter-signal. It is the creative power turning against its own intention. And so he learns to use the waiting period as a practice of deepening trust, of returning again and again to the inner state of the wish fulfilled, of feeling forward into the reality being called forth, rather than anxiously measuring the distance between here and there. There is also a profound shift in the relationship with failure at this level. What the warrior experienced as defeat, what the victim experienced as confirmation of powerlessness, the conscious creator experiences as feedback. Precise, honest, invaluable feedback about the gap between the stated intention and the actual inner state from which it was being broadcast. Every result that does not match the desired outcome is a mirror showing something that was operating below the level of conscious awareness. An unexamined belief, a fear that was present beneath the surface confidence, a frequency of doubt that was louder than the words of affirmation layered over it. This reframe does not make difficulty painless. The conscious creator is not immune to disappointment, to frustration, to the genuine grief that accompanies the gap between vision and present reality. But he does not interpret difficulty as evidence that the system is broken, or that he is uniquely disadvantaged. He interprets it as information, and he uses it to refine, to deepen, to bring the inner state into closer and closer alignment with what is being called forth. The sixth level is also the level at which the individual creative act begins to expand beyond the personal. The conscious creator who has genuinely inhabited the witness's clarity and the heart's compassion does not create only for himself. He cannot, because the dissolution of the hard boundary between self and other, which began at the fifth level.
There are places language cannot go, not because language is inadequate, though at its outermost edge it is, but because what we are about to explore is not a concept to be understood, it is a reality to be recognized. And recognition does not happen through the accumulation of more words. It happens in the silence between them, in the space that opens when the mind, for just a moment, stops its relentless commentary on existence and simply allows itself to be. What we are pointing toward now has been given many names across the centuries of human wisdom: enlightenment, samadhi, union, the kingdom of heaven, satori, the Tao, moksha, non-dual awareness. Different words, different cultural costumes, but every genuine tradition that has explored the deepest territories of human consciousness has arrived through different paths at the same astonishing destination. This is the seventh level, unity consciousness, the penthouse of the building of being. And the first thing that must be said about it, with complete honesty, is that it cannot be fully described, not because it is mysterious in the theatrical sense, not because it is being deliberately withheld from those who have not yet reached it, but because description itself is a function of separation. To describe something, there must be a describer and a thing being described. There must be a subject and an object. There must be distance between the one who is speaking and the thing being spoken of. And at the seventh level, that distance has dissolved. Not metaphorically, not as a pleasant spiritual sentiment, but as the direct, lived, unambiguous recognition that the awareness which is looking and the reality which is being looked at are not two separate things encountering each other across an unbridgeable divide. They are one continuous movement of being, one undivided field of consciousness expressing itself simultaneously as the observer and the observed, as the knower and the known, as the self and the world the self inhabits. This is what the mystics meant when they spoke of union, not the merging of two things that were previously separate, like rivers joining the ocean, but the recognition that the separation was always apparent rather than actual, that the ocean was always already present and the rivers were its own movement, temporarily appearing as distinct forms before returning, inevitably, to the source they never actually left. The individual who lives from this level does not experience themselves as a self navigating through a world of other separate selves and objects. They experience themselves as the totality expressing itself through a particular form, a particular perspective, a particular configuration of matter and consciousness that is unique and temporary and utterly magnificently unreservedly real, and simultaneously not separate from the whole of which it is an expression. This is not the loss of individuality. This is perhaps the most common misunderstanding of the seventh level, the fear that unity means dissolution, that to merge with everything is to cease to exist as a someone, that the personal will be swallowed by the universal, that the particular will be extinguished in the infinite. But those who have genuinely touched this level report something entirely different. They report not the disappearance of the individual, but the liberation of the individual. The personal perspective does not vanish, it becomes the instrument through which the whole experiences itself. The wave does not cease to be a wave when it recognizes itself as ocean. It becomes more fully, more freely, more authentically a wave, because it is no longer constricted by the fear of being separate, no longer exhausted by the effort of maintaining the illusion of isolation, no longer defended against the rest of the ocean in the desperate attempt to preserve its individual form. The emotional signature of this level is unlike anything encountered on the lower levels, not because it is more intense. In fact, in many ways it is quieter, more ordinary, more intimate with the texture of daily existence than any of the more dramatic states of the lower levels. But it carries a quality that no lower level could produce and no language can fully capture. The traditions have called it bliss, but bliss, as this word is commonly understood, as an elevated emotional high, a peak experience, a state of rapturous feeling, is not quite right. The bliss of the seventh level is not an emotional state arising in response to favorable circumstances. It is the background condition of existence itself when the friction of separation has dissolved. It is what remains when the chronic low-frequency suffering of believing yourself to be isolated, which runs beneath even the most successful life at the lower levels, is finally, completely, irrevocably released. It is peace that does not depend on anything, joy that does not require a reason, love that does not need an object, because everything is its object. Everything is recognized as belonging to the same family of being. The stranger on the street, the difficult person, the animal, the tree, the stone, the vast, indifferent beauty of the cosmos arranging and rearranging itself in patterns of breathtaking complexity across billions of years. All of it,
every particle, every moment, every configuration of matter and energy and consciousness recognized as an expression of the same singular, inexhaustible, intimate aliveness. At this level, the experience of time also transforms in ways that are difficult to convey. The lower levels were all, in different ways, imprisoned by the horizontal dimension of time, by the story of past and future that the mind constructs and then inhabits as though it were more real than the present moment. At the seventh level, the vertical dimension of time, the depth of the eternal present, becomes primary. Not in a way that makes practical daily life impossible. The person living from this level still has appointments, still experiences the sequence of events, still operates within the ordinary coordinates of human existence, but they are rooted in something that does not move, something that all time moves through without disturbing. This is what the Gospel of John was pointing at with the words, "I am." Not a personal claim, not an assertion of ego, but the recognition of the eternal present tense of pure being, the awareness that is not in time, but in which time occurs, and the discovery that this awareness is not foreign, not distant, not accessible only to the specially gifted or the religiously ordained. It is the most intimate reality there is, closer than breath, closer than thought, the very ground of what you are, always already present, always already whole, waiting with infinite patience beneath the noise of the unexamined mind for the moment of recognition. The conscious creator of the sixth level worked with consciousness as a tool, as an instrument for shaping reality in accordance with intention. At the seventh level, even that subtle subject-object relationship dissolves. There is no longer a creator separate from the creation. There is only creating, only the continuous, spontaneous, effortless arising of experience from the inexhaustible ground of being. Action still occurs. The person living from this level is not passive, not withdrawn, not indifferent to the world, but action arises not from a personal agenda being imposed upon reality. It arises as the natural, appropriate, organically perfect response of consciousness to each moment as it presents itself. This is what the Taoists called Wu Wei. Action without the friction of a self trying to control what happens. Not passivity, but perfect responsiveness. The action of a master musician who is no longer thinking about technique, but has become the music itself. The action of a great teacher who is no longer applying a method, but has become the understanding she is transmitting. The action of someone who has stopped trying to live their life and has allowed life to live itself through them with full, joyful, completely committed participation. The shadow of this level, and it must be named because even here, in the highest reaches of human consciousness, the invitation to misunderstanding persists, is the temptation to use the recognition of unity as a reason to disengage from the world, to interpret the peace of non-separation as permission to withdraw from the complexity and difficulty of human existence, to say all is one and therefore nothing requires my active engagement, to allow the beauty of the absolute to eclipse the importance of the relative. But the greatest expressions of this level in human history have always been characterized by extraordinary engagement with the world. Not the anxious, effortful, driven engagement of the lower levels, but a full, free, fearless participation in the human story, motivated not by the need to prove something, not by the hunger for acquisition, not by the fear of irrelevance, but the natural overflow of love that arises when the heart recognizes itself in everything it sees. The Buddha did not retreat into formless awareness after his enlightenment and disappear. He spent decades walking through the dust of India.
There is a particular kind of knowledge that changes everything and nothing. You can receive the most precise and luminous map of consciousness ever assembled. You can understand every level with intellectual clarity. You can describe the architecture of the 7 floors with eloquence and accuracy. and yet wake up tomorrow morning in the same patterns, the same reactions, the same quietly suffocating loops that have defined your experience for years. Because understanding is not transformation. And this distinction, simple to state, profound in its implications, is perhaps the most important truth that could be offered after everything that has been shared. The map has been given. Now comes the only question that has ever actually mattered. What will you do with it? Not in the grand, heroic sense, not the dramatic gesture of a life overhauled in a single weekend of inspired intention, but in the small, specific, daily, unglamorous sense that real transformation actually lives in. In the ordinary Tuesday morning when everything in you wants to react from the old pattern, and you pause. In the conversation that triggers the familiar contraction, and instead of following it automatically, you notice it. In the moment the victim's voice rises with its ancient complaint, and you recognize it not as truth, but as a level, a floor, and you remember that you are not required to live there. This is what integration means. Not the acquisition of a new identity to perform, not the replacement of the old self with a spiritually upgraded version, but the slow, honest, sometimes uncomfortable, ultimately liberating process of bringing the understanding that has been received into actual lived experience, into the body, into the breath, into the texture of how you move through an ordinary day. The single most common reason people receive transformative knowledge and remain unchanged is this: they process it entirely in the mind. They think about the 7 levels. They categorize their experiences according to the framework. They identify which level other people are operating from with satisfying precision, and they mistake this intellectual engagement for the genuine inner work that the knowledge was pointing toward. Real integration requires something the mind resists with impressive creativity. It requires feeling. Not the performance of feeling, not the narration of feeling, but the actual, direct, sometimes overwhelming experience of what is alive in the body right now. Because the body is where the old levels live, not an abstract belief system stored in the intellect, but in the tension held in the jaw, in the chronic guardedness of the chest, in the subtle bracing of the belly that has been present for so long it has been mistaken for the natural condition of being alive. Every unprocessed emotional experience from the past that was never fully felt because it was too overwhelming, or because the environment was not safe enough, or because survival required its suppression, is stored in the tissues of the body as a pattern of contraction. And those patterns, accumulated across a lifetime, are the physical substrate of the lower levels of consciousness. They are the victim's helplessness, held in the slump of the shoulders, the warrior's chronic tension, held in the hardness of the abdomen, the seeker's anxiety, held in the restlessness of the hands. Integration means going back for what was left behind, not in the spirit of excavating trauma for its own sake, not in the pursuit of endless psychological archaeology, but with the simple, compassionate willingness to feel what was not felt, to breathe into the places that have been held, to allow the body to complete the experiences it was interrupted in the middle of. Because the nervous system, left to its own intelligence, knows how to heal. It knows how to process and release and return to its natural state of openness and flow. What it needs is not more information. It needs permission and the courage to feel. This is the practice that underlies all practices. Before meditation, before intention setting, before any technique drawn from any tradition, the foundational work is simply this: learning to be present to your own experience without immediately fleeing it, without reaching for distraction, without launching into analysis, without performing the feeling for an imagined audience, just being with what is, fully, honestly, without resistance. The moment you stop resisting an experience and simply allow it, something shifts. Not always dramatically, not always immediately, but always.
Because resistance is what gives difficult experience its power to persist. The thing we run from follows us. The thing we turn toward and meet directly loses its authority over us. Not because confronting it destroys it, but because the act of genuine presence reveals that it was never as solid, never as permanent, never as defining as the resistance made it appear. There is also a dimension of integration that happens not in solitude, but in relationship. Because the levels of consciousness are not private inner states that exist independently of how we relate to other human beings. They are expressed, revealed, tested, deepened, and sometimes dismantled precisely in the friction and the intimacy and the beautiful difficulty of genuine human connection. You can reach profound states of stillness in meditation. You can touch genuine openness in solitary contemplation. You can feel the dissolution of the boundary between self and world in moments of natural beauty or creative flow. And then a particular person says a particular thing, and the reaction that arises is so immediate, so total, so completely at odds with the level you believed you were inhabiting, that the gap between understanding and actual embodiment becomes impossible to deny. This is not failure. This is the most valuable feedback available. Relationship is the mirror that shows you with ruthless precision exactly where the work still lives. Every trigger is a teacher. Every reaction that feels disproportionate to its cause is pointing at something unfinished within you that has nothing to do with the person who activated it. Every moment of genuine connection, every instance of being truly seen and truly seeing is a doorway into the higher levels that no amount of solitary practice can fully open on its own. The practice of integration in relationship is the practice of bringing the witness's awareness into the moment of activation, of creating even the smallest gap between stimulus and response, of noticing the reaction beginning to arise, feeling it in the body, recognizing its origin in the old levels, and making the conscious choice not to suppress it, but to respond from a higher floor than the one it came from. This gap, this microsecond of awareness between trigger and response, is where freedom lives. It is small. It is often difficult to access in the heat of the moment. It requires practice, repeated, patient, sometimes frustrating practice, but it grows. Each time it is accessed, even imperfectly, the neural pathway of awareness is strengthened. The capacity for conscious response rather than automatic reaction deepens. And gradually, over time, not in the dramatic transformation of a single peak experience, but in the quiet, cumulative momentum of consistent practice, the higher levels stop being places you visit and become the ground you live from. There is something else that must be addressed honestly, the non-linearity of this journey, because the map of 7 levels presented in sequence can create the impression of a clean, orderly, progressive ascent. Level 1 completed, then 2, then 3, a tidy staircase climbed one step at a time. Real transformation does not work this way. Real transformation is cyclical, spiral, sometimes apparently regressive. You will touch genuine states of witness consciousness and then find yourself deep in victim thinking the following morning. You will experience genuine heart opening and then contract back into the warrior's defensiveness under sufficient pressure. You will glimpse unity consciousness in a moment of extraordinary stillness and then spend the rest of the day in the seeker's restless searching. This is not failure. It is not evidence that the transformation is not real. It is the nature of genuine growth, which does not move in straight lines, but in spirals, revisiting the same territories from progressively deeper understanding, integrating the same lessons at progressively more fundamental levels of the being. The appropriate response to apparent regression is not despair. It is not harsh self-judgment, which is itself the victim and warrior in disguise, one collapsing in self-pity, the other attacking the self for its inadequacy. The appropriate response is the same quality that makes all genuine transformation possible: compassionate awareness.
the willingness to see clearly where you are without condemning yourself for not being somewhere else, the recognition that the very fact you are noticing the old pattern is itself evidence of growth. You cannot observe a level from within it. Observation requires a higher vantage point, and the moment you see the basement clearly, you are already at least partially above it. This is what the entire journey has been building toward. Not arrival at a permanent, fixed, unchanging state of enlightenment that resolves all difficulty and exempts you from the ordinary demands of human existence, but the development of a living, dynamic, ever-deepening relationship with your own consciousness.
Everything that has been understood must eventually become something simpler, more immediate, more intimate than any framework, however luminous, can remain when it lives only in the realm of concept. Because concepts, however profound, are furniture in the mind, and the mind, however refined, is not where transformation actually happens. Transformation happens in the moment, in the breath, in the body, in the unremarkable Tuesday afternoon when nothing spiritually significant appears to be occurring, and yet the quality of presence brought to that ordinary moment is the entire practice distilled to its essence. This is what we turn to now. Not more architecture, not more understanding of what the levels are and how they function, but the question of how, specifically, practically, honestly, a human being begins to live from higher consciousness, not as an occasional peak experience, but as the steady, reliable, ever-deepening ground of daily existence. The answer is not glamorous. It never has been. Every tradition that has genuinely transformed human beings across the centuries has known this and said it clearly, in different languages and different cultural forms, but always arriving at the same essential instruction. The quality of your life is determined by the quality of your attention. And the quality of your attention is determined by where you place it, how consistently you place it there, and whether you have the self-knowledge to recognize when it has been taken elsewhere. This is practice, not the performance of practice, not the accumulation of practices as a form of spiritual identity construction, but the actual, daily, sometimes boring, always revelatory discipline of returning attention to what matters, again and again, without drama, without the expectation of perpetual inspiration, with the simple, steady faithfulness of someone who has understood that the direction of attention is the most consequential choice available to a human being. The first and most foundational daily practice is what might be called the morning establishment. Before the day makes its demands, before the phone delivers its cascade of external stimulation, before the mind begins its habitual cataloging of what needs to be done, what went wrong yesterday, what might go wrong today, there is a window. Brief, sometimes narrow, but always present, the window between sleep and full engagement with the ordinary world. In that window, the nervous system is still soft. The habitual patterns of thought have not yet fully reasserted themselves. The identity constructed through years of accumulated conditioning has not yet fully armored itself for the day. And in that softness, in that brief porousness between sleep and waking, access to the deeper levels is easier than at almost any other point in the day. The practice is not complex. Sit. Before doing anything else, before coffee, before checking messages, before any consumption of any kind, simply sit in stillness for whatever duration is genuinely available. 5 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour. The duration matters less than the consistency. And in that stillness, do not try to achieve a particular state. Do not reach for bliss or clarity or any experience that has been described as desirable. Simply observe what is present.
the sounds in the room, the sensation of breath moving in the body, the thoughts that arise and pass without requiring response or engagement. This is not meditation as a technique to be perfected. It is the daily act of remembering what you are before the world tells you what to be. It is the practice of making contact, however briefly, with the witness, the still aware presence beneath the contents of the mind, before immersing in the day's flow of content. And that contact, made consistently over days and weeks and months and years, gradually changes the texture of everything that follows, not through effort, but through the slow, cumulative deepening of familiarity with the ground of your own being. The second practice is what might be called the pause, and it is deployed not in the sanctuary of the morning sitting, but in the full heat of ordinary life. In the moment of activation, in the instant when something external, a word, a situation, a memory, an unexpected frustration, triggers the old pattern, the old level, the familiar contraction. The pause is simply this: before responding, before reacting, before the automatic machinery of the conditioned self completes its habitual sequence, a breath. One conscious breath, taken with full awareness of the body, feeling the chest expand, the belly soften, the nervous system given the microsecond it needs to shift from reaction to response. This sounds almost insultingly simple. It is not. In the moment of genuine activation, taking one conscious breath before responding is an act of extraordinary inner discipline. It is the entire practice of consciousness elevation distilled into a single physical act. Because in that breath, the witness is invoked, the identification with the reactive pattern is interrupted, the automatic execution of the lower level is paused, and in that pause, however brief, a choice becomes available that was not available a moment before. The choice of how to respond, from which floor, with which quality of consciousness, with how much awareness of what is actually happening beneath the surface of the external situation. That choice, made in the heat of a real moment, is worth more than hours of intellectual understanding about the levels of consciousness, because it is transformation happening in the actual territory of life, not in the controlled, quiet environment of the meditation cushion, but in the friction and complexity and unpredictability of genuine human experience. The third practice is the evening review, and it is perhaps the most underestimated of all practices because it requires no special posture, no particular setting, no extended period of time. It requires only honesty and 5 minutes of genuine reflection before sleep. The question is simple: from which level did I primarily operate today? Not as a judgment, not as an occasion for the warrior's self-criticism or the victim's self-pity, but as an honest, curious, compassionate assessment of the day's inner landscape. Were there moments of victim thinking, of blame, of complaint, of helplessness? Were there moments of warrior consciousness, of productive effort, but also of unnecessary struggle, of fighting what could have been flowed with? Were there moments of witness, of observing the mind without being consumed by it? Were there moments of heart, of genuine compassion, of real connection, of seeing the other as fully real? And then, without judgment, without drama, the question of intention. Tomorrow, in the specific situations that are already known to be arriving, which level is the genuine aspiration? Not the performance of a higher level, not the suppression of whatever arises from the lower, but the honest, grounded, realistic intention to bring 1 degree more awareness, 1 degree more compassion, 1 degree more conscious choice to the moments that will inevitably test the level that is being claimed.
This review, practiced consistently, creates something invaluable, a living record of inner development that is far more accurate and far more useful than any external measure of achievement. It cultivates the habit of honest self-observation that all genuine growth depends upon, and it closes each day with the conscious acknowledgement that who you were today is not a fixed destiny, it is a starting point for tomorrow. The fourth practice concerns the use of difficulty, because difficulty is not an obstacle to the practice of higher consciousness. It is the practice. The most important moments of genuine inner development do not happen in stillness. They happen in the conversation that did not go as intended, in the relationship that is asking more of you than feels comfortable, in the professional setback that activates every insecurity that has been quietly cultivated across decades, in the physical limitation that the body presents when the mind has other plans. These are not interruptions of the spiritual journey. They are the spiritual journey. Every difficulty is the precise curriculum that the level of consciousness currently being inhabited requires for its own transcendence. Not because suffering is intrinsically valuable, not because hardship is noble, but because difficulty, met with genuine awareness and honest willingness to feel what it brings up, reveals the exact places.
There is a particular kind of silence that exists at the end of a genuine journey. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of having nothing left to say, but the silence of completion. The quality of stillness that arrives when something that needed to be received has been received, when something that needed to be understood has found its way, not just into the mind, but into the deeper layers of the being where real knowing lives. This is that silence, and before it is fully allowed to settle, there is one final thing that must be said, not as an addition to everything that has come before, but as the distillation of it, the single thread that runs through every level, every practice, every insight that has been offered across this entire journey. You are not who you thought you were. Not in the way the victim thought it, as a diminishment, as evidence of inadequacy, as the painful recognition of falling short of an external standard, but in the most liberating sense those words have ever carried. The self that began this journey, the self defined by its history, its wounds, its habitual patterns, its inherited beliefs about what is possible and what it deserves and what it is, that self was never the whole story. It was a chapter, an important chapter, filled with real experience and genuine wisdom accumulated through genuine difficulty, but a chapter nonetheless. And chapters, by their nature, give way to what follows. What follows is not a new self constructed from superior materials, not an upgraded identity assembled from the insights gathered along the way. What follows is something older and more fundamental than any identity the mind has ever produced. The awareness beneath the identity, the presence before the story, the being that was always there, prior to every role, every label, every definition the world offered and the self accepted as its own. This is what the entire map was pointing at, not the acquisition of a higher level of consciousness as though it were a possession to be obtained and displayed, but the recognition of what was always already present beneath the levels. The ground from which every level arises and into which every level dissolves, the unchanging awareness in which the entire drama of human development, from the basement of victimhood to the penthouse of unity, occurs as a movement of light across a sky that is itself never altered by the clouds that move through it. You are the sky. You were always the sky. The clouds were real. The storms were real. The darkness of certain seasons was genuinely dark, and the pain it carried was genuinely painful. None of that is being dismissed or diminished, but the sky was present through all of it, unchanged,
unchangeable, patiently holding every experience without being defined by any of them. This recognition, when it moves from concept into felt reality, changes the relationship with everything. With the past, first of all, because the past, seen from this recognition, is no longer a prison sentence, no longer a deterministic force that explains and limits the present. It is a series of experiences that occurred within the sky of awareness, some of them beautiful, some of them devastating, all of them complete, all of them ultimately in service of the depth of understanding that has been accumulated through living them. The difficult experiences especially, the losses that seemed unbearable, the failures that seemed final, the relationships that collapsed, the identities that were outgrown, the periods of darkness that felt as though they would never end. Seen from the higher levels, these were not punishments, they were not evidence of a universe indifferent to human suffering. They were the precise curriculum of a consciousness preparing itself for something it could not yet see. They were the pressure that creates the diamond, the friction that polishes the stone, the darkness that makes the white, when it finally arrives, genuinely visible. This does not mean that suffering is to be sought. It does not mean that difficulty is always welcome or that pain is always instructive. It means that nothing, not a single experience, not a single moment of genuine human living is without the potential for depth, without the potential to become, in the hands of an awakening consciousness, a doorway rather than a wall. The relationship with the future also transforms from this recognition, because the future, seen from the higher levels, is not a territory of threat to be defended against, or a horizon of desire to be desperately pursued. It is an open field of possibility that is shaped continuously and powerfully by the quality of consciousness brought to this moment. The future is not fixed, it is not predetermined, it is the living consequence of inner states being cultivated right now. And those inner states, the quality of awareness, the depth of belief, the emotional frequency being maintained, the level of consciousness being inhabited, are the most leverage-rich point in the entire system of a human life. This is not a burden, though it can initially feel like one, the recognition that you are responsible for your own experience, that the quality of your consciousness is the primary determinant of the quality of your life, that there are no external forces to blame and no external saviors to wait for. Initially, that recognition can feel immense, can feel like too much to carry. But that feeling is the final remnant of the basement talking. Because the sky does not experience responsibility as a burden. The sky simply is, and in simply being, with full, free, unbounded awareness, it holds everything, effortlessly, without strain, without the exhausting effort of trying to control what cannot be controlled, or resist what cannot be resisted. The genuine acceptance of creative responsibility, the full embrace of the understanding that consciousness shapes reality and that the quality of your consciousness is the most important work of your life, is not a burden when it is accepted from the seventh level. It is a liberation. It is the final release from the prison of waiting, from the exhausting posture of someone who believes their well-being depends on the right external circumstances finally aligning, from the particular suffering of a life lived in the passive tense. It is the embrace of authorship, complete, courageous, joyful authorship. Not the authorship of the warrior who forces his will upon the page, but the authorship of someone who has learned to listen, to the deeper intelligence that moves through every life when the noise of the unexamined mind is finally quiet enough to allow it to move, to the subtle signals of genuine intuition that are always present beneath the louder claims of fear and habit, to the quiet, unshakable certainty of the inner voice that knows not what the mind thinks should be done, not what others expect, not what habit recommends, but what is genuinely true, what is genuinely aligned, what is genuinely alive. That voice has always been there. in every person who has ever lived, in every consciousness that has ever moved through the extraordinary and improbable experience of being human. It was present in the basement. It was present on the battlefield. It was present in every moment of seeking, of witnessing, of opening, of creating. It was whispering beneath the noise of every level, patient and unwavering and completely certain of what it was pointing toward. Some people call it the soul. Some call it higher self. Some call it the divine within. Some have no name for it at all, only the felt sense of its presence in moments of genuine stillness. The moment before a decision when something below thought simply knows. The inexplicable sense of rightness when a choice is aligned with something deeper than preference or strategy. The quiet, unshakable certainty that arrives not through reasoning, but through being. Whatever name it carries or refuses to carry, trust it. That is the final instruction. After all the levels have been mapped, and all the practices have been offered, and all the understanding has been received, trust that voice. Return to it daily. Build a relationship with it through the faithfulness of consistent practice. Learn to distinguish it from the louder voices of fear and habit and borrowed belief that crowd the inner landscape. And when it speaks, in whatever language it uses for you, in whatever form it takes in your particular consciousness, have the courage to follow it. Because that voice is not leading you toward a destination that can be described in advance. It is not pointing at a fixed arrival point where the journey finally ends and permanent comfort begins. It is leading you deeper, always deeper, into more authentic expression of what you genuinely are, into more honest relationship with what is genuinely real, into more complete, more courageous, more fully inhabited presence in the unrepeatable life that is uniquely, specifically, irreplaceably yours. There will be mornings when the basement feels very close again, when the old patterns rise with surprising force, and the distance between where you are and where you know you can be feels enormous and discouraging. On those mornings, remember this. The gap between where you are and where you know you can be is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of vision. You cannot see a gap unless you have already, in some part of your being, accessed both sides of it. The very fact of the longing for...
There is a territory that most spiritual teachings quietly avoid, not because it is forbidden, not because it is dangerous beyond navigation, but because it is uncomfortable in a way that the mind, even the awakening mind, even the mind that has tasted genuine higher consciousness, instinctively recoils from. It is the territory of the shadow. And no map of consciousness, however luminous, however carefully drawn, is complete without it. Because the shadow is not the opposite of the light. It is not the enemy of awakening. It is not the proof that transformation has failed or that the higher levels are inaccessible. The shadow is, in the most precise and honest sense, the part of you that has not yet been loved enough to reveal itself. The part that was judged too dangerous, too shameful, too unacceptable to be allowed into the light of conscious awareness, and so it was pushed down, hidden, denied, buried beneath layers of self-presentation so thick and so habitual that the burial itself was eventually forgotten. But what is buried does not disappear. It does not dissolve through neglect. It does not weaken through sustained suppression. It goes underground. And from underground, with remarkable patience and extraordinary creativity, it continues to shape the life being lived on the surface. In the reactions that feel disproportionate, in the patterns that repeat despite every conscious intention to break them, in the relationships that recreate the same dynamics with different faces, in the inexplicable self-sabotage that interrupts the progress of someone who is genuinely trying, sincerely committed, doing everything the understanding they have received suggests they should be doing. The shadow is the missing piece, and the willingness to turn toward it with honesty, with compassion, with the steady presence of the witness who has learned to observe without flinching, is not a detour from the path of awakening. It is among the most direct routes available.
Carl Jung, who gave the shadow its most precise modern articulation, understood something that the purely transcendental spiritual traditions sometimes missed: that the path toward wholeness does not run through the suppression or transcendence of the darker aspects of the human psyche. It runs directly through them. The gold, he said, is in the shadow. The very qualities that were deemed unacceptable, that were rejected and buried and denied, carry within them an energy and a power that the surface personality desperately needs. And the integration of those qualities, the reclamation of what was abandoned, is not a descent into darkness, but an ascent into genuine completeness. What lives in the shadow is different for every person, because the shadow is formed by rejection, and what gets rejected depends on the specific environment, the family, the culture, the religion, the social context into which a particular consciousness was born and developed. For the child raised in an environment where anger was dangerous, anger itself was rejected, pushed underground, and on the surface, a personality of extraordinary agreeableness was constructed, helpful, accommodating, conflict-avoiding, while beneath, the rejected anger accumulated, finding its expression in passive aggression, in psychosomatic symptoms, in the slow erosion of authentic self-expression. For the child raised in an environment where vulnerability was weakness, the capacity for genuine openness was buried. A personality of strength and self-sufficiency was constructed on the surface, while beneath, the rejected vulnerability generated a hunger for genuine connection that the constructed surface could never satisfy, because genuine connection requires exactly the vulnerability that was deemed unacceptable. For the child raised in an environment where ambition was condemned as selfishness, the natural drive toward expansion and achievement was pushed underground. A personality of apparent contentment was constructed on the surface, while beneath, the suppressed ambition expressed itself in resentment toward those who pursued their desires openly, a resentment that felt like moral judgment but was in truth the mirror of something unfulfilled within. This is the fundamental mechanism. What is rejected in the self is projected onto others. The qualities we cannot accept in ourselves, we see with disproportionate intensity in the people around us. The things that trigger the most visceral reaction, the behaviors that produce not just discomfort, but something closer to revulsion, to moral outrage, to the particular heat of judgment that feels righteous and absolute. These are the most reliable compass points towards the shadow. The person who reacts with disproportionate anger towards those who appear weak is carrying suppressed vulnerability. The person who judges the selfishness of others with unusual intensity is carrying suppressed desire. The person who cannot tolerate dishonesty in others, who monitors it with almost obsessive attention, is carrying suppressed aspects of their own relationship with truth. Not because they are dishonest in the simple behavioral sense, but because the psyche is more complex than behavior, and the intensity of the judgment is always pointing at something alive and unacknowledged within the one who is judging. This is not comfortable to hear. It was not comfortable for Jung's patients to hear. It is not comfortable for anyone committed to a positive self-image to hear, because it asks a question that the ego, at every level of development, resists with remarkable ingenuity. What if the thing I most dislike in others is the thing I have most thoroughly refused to see in myself? Sitting with that question honestly, without rushing to dismiss it or defend against it, is one of the most courageous acts available to a human being. Because the answer, when it arrives, and it does arrive in the stillness of genuine self-inquiry, is almost never comfortable and almost always liberating. Because liberation in this territory does not come from eliminating the shadow quality. It does not come from finally succeeding in suppressing what has always found a way through. It comes from integration, from the willingness to look at the rejected aspect of the self with the same compassionate awareness that the witness brings to any other content of the mind, to see it clearly, to understand its origin in the specific circumstances of a childhood that required certain adaptations for survival. Adaptations that were intelligent then and have become obstacles now.
to recognize it not as evidence of fundamental corruption, but as a part of the human being that has been exiled and is asking, with increasing urgency, to come home. The anger that was buried does not need to be expressed destructively. It needs to be felt fully, acknowledged honestly, and then integrated as the healthy, necessary, life-affirming force it was always meant to be. Anger in its integrated form is the energy of boundary, of self-respect, of the clear and unambiguous statement that certain things are not acceptable. Without access to that energy, the boundary cannot be held, the self cannot be genuinely protected, and the apparent kindness of the person who cannot say no is revealed on closer examination as the exhausted performance of someone who has lost contact with their own needs. The vulnerability that was buried does not need to remain hidden as protection. It needs to be offered, carefully, discerningly, to relationships that have demonstrated their trustworthiness. Because vulnerability in its integrated form is not weakness. It is the gateway to genuine intimacy. It is the quality that makes authentic connection possible. Without it, the surface interactions of even the most socially successful life remain at their core performances, exchanges between constructed personas rather than meetings between actual human beings. The ambition that was condemned does not need to be suppressed out of spiritual correctness. It needs to be reclaimed as the natural, healthy expression of a consciousness that wants to grow, to expand, to contribute something meaningful to the world. Because ambition in its integrated form is not selfishness. It is the creative force of life itself moving through a particular human being toward fuller expression. Without it, the life contracts, the contribution diminishes, and the resentment of others' expansion, which is simply the mirror of the expansion being denied within, quietly poisons the inner landscape. The integration of the shadow is not a single event. It is not accomplished through a breakthrough experience, or a particularly honest journal entry, or a profound conversation with a trusted other, though all of these can initiate the process. It is the practice of noticing what is triggered, inquiring into what the trigger reveals, and bringing the compassionate awareness of the witness to what is found there. It is the practice of meeting yourself fully, not the curated version, not the version that has been refined through years of spiritual practice into something that looks like equanimity, but is in truth suppression wearing a more sophisticated costume. But the complete, contradictory, sometimes uncomfortable, always more interesting version, the one that contains multitudes, the one that has darkness alongside the light and finds in the honest acknowledgement of both a wholeness that neither alone could provide. Because this is the truth that the shadow teaches ultimately, that wholeness is not the elimination of the difficult dimensions of the human experience. It is their integration, their inclusion in a larger field of awareness that is big enough to hold all of it, the light and the shadow, the strength and the vulnerability, the clarity and the confusion, the love and the rage, the certainty and the doubt. All of it human, all of it real, all of it, when met with genuine awareness and genuine compassion, revelatory of the extraordinary depth and complexity.
There is something that happens at the end of a genuine journey that is different from what happens at the end of an ordinary trip. At the end of an ordinary trip, you return to where you started, the same person, the same home, the same life reassembling itself around you as though the journey had been a parenthesis, interesting, perhaps, valuable, but ultimately external to the self that remains unchanged at the center. A genuine journey does not work this way. A genuine journey changes the traveler, not in the superficial sense of accumulated experience or expanded knowledge, but in the deeper sense of altered perception. The person who arrives at the end of a genuine journey looks back at the starting point and sees it differently, not because the starting point has changed, but because the eyes looking at it have. You began somewhere, perhaps in confusion, perhaps in a quiet, persistent dissatisfaction that you could not name but could not ignore.
Perhaps in the specific pain of a life that was functional by every external measure and yet felt somehow hollow at its center. Perhaps simply in curiosity, the genuine, open, intellectually honest curiosity of someone who sensed that the reality being presented by ordinary consciousness was not the whole story. Whatever brought you here, whatever quality of longing or pain or curiosity or readiness initiated this journey, it was not an accident. Nothing that moves a human being toward genuine self-inquiry is accidental. The timing is always precise. The readiness is always real, even when it does not feel that way. Even when the beginning felt tentative or uncertain, or accompanied by the particular vulnerability of someone who does not yet know whether what they are reaching for is actually there. It is there. It was always there, and everything that has been shared across this entire journey was never introducing you to something foreign. It was pointing you back towards something intimate, something original, something that preceded every story, every wound, every level of consciousness that was inhabited along the way. The awareness that you are, the presence that has been present through every experience without being altered by any of them. This is the completion that a genuine journey arrives at, not a destination where something new is finally acquired, but a recognition of what was always already the case. A homecoming not to a place that was left behind, but to a ground that was always beneath the feet, always supporting, always present, simply unseen through the layers of conditioning, of habit, of identification with the contents of the mind, rather than the awareness in which those contents arose. The 7 levels were not a ladder to climb and leave behind. They were a map of a territory that remains alive and present within every human consciousness. The victim's voice does not disappear when higher levels are inhabited. The warrior's energy does not become irrelevant when the heart opens. The seeker's restlessness does not vanish when the witness is established. All of it remains. All of it continues to speak. The difference, the only difference, but a difference that changes everything, is the relationship with what arises. From the lower levels, the contents of consciousness are reality. They are obeyed automatically, suffered unconsciously, projected outward without examination. From the higher levels, the contents of consciousness are weather, real weather, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, sometimes breathtakingly beautiful, but weather nonetheless, moving through a sky that remains, in its essential nature, unchanged. You are the sky. This was the first thing pointed at. This is the last thing pointed at. Everything in between was the slow, necessary, sometimes painful, ultimately liberating process of demonstrating it through direct experience, rather than simply stating it as a concept to be accepted or rejected by the intellect. Because the intellect, however sophisticated, cannot know what only direct experience can reveal. You cannot think your way to the recognition of what you are. You cannot reason your way to genuine compassion. You cannot strategize your way to unity consciousness. You cannot accumulate enough knowledge to substitute for the single, simple, revolutionary act of turning attention around and meeting, directly and without mediation, the awareness that is looking. That meeting is available right now. Not at the end of more practice, not after the resolution of the remaining difficulties, not once the shadow has been fully integrated or the witness has been more thoroughly established or the heart has opened to a greater degree. Right now, in this moment, with this breath, whatever the current state of the inner landscape, however turbulent or still, however clear or confused, the awareness in which all of it is arising is already present, already whole, already the thing that every level of this journey was pointing toward. Feel that, not as a concept, not as a belief to be adopted, but as a direct, immediate, living reality, the simple fact of awareness, the undeniable presence of knowing, the certainty more fundamental than any thought that experience is happening, that there is something it is like to be here, that the light of consciousness is on, that you are. This is the ground. This is what nothing can touch. This is what survives every loss, every failure, every dismantling of every identity that was mistaken for the self. This is what the victim was protecting when it built its prison. This is what the warrior was fighting for when he believed victory would finally deliver it. This is what the seeker was searching for in every teaching and every teacher and every practice. This is what the witness discovered when the identification with thought loosened enough to reveal the awareness beneath it. This is what the heart recognized in the other. This is what the Creator worked with as the deepest source of genuine power. This is what the unity of the seventh level named, inadequately but sincerely, as the dissolution of the boundary between self and everything. It was here all along, before the journey began, during every step of the journey, and here at the end of it, not as a reward for having traveled well, but as the nature of what was always already the case. Now comes the question that every genuine ending asks, not the intellectual question of what was learned or what was understood, but the living question of what comes next. What does a life look like lived from the ground of this recognition? What does an ordinary Tuesday become when it is inhabited by a consciousness that has touched, however briefly and however imperfectly, the reality of its own nature?
It becomes everything. That is the answer that sounds like a spiritual platitude, but is, when genuinely tasted, a precise description of lived experience. The ordinary Tuesday becomes everything, because everything is recognized as the expression of the same singular aliveness that is looking through your eyes right now. The morning light through the window, the sound of other lives moving through the building, the sensation of breath, the taste of coffee, the particular quality of the silence between sounds. None of it is small. None of it is ordinary in the sense of being beneath notice or beneath gratitude. All of it is the extraordinary improbability of existence arranging itself into this specific configuration, in this specific moment, for this specific consciousness to encounter. And the consciousness that has done the genuine work of self-inquiry meets it differently, not with the grasping of someone who is perpetually hungry for more, not with the indifference of someone who has retreated from the world into the private sanctuary of inner states, but with the full, awake, deeply moved presence of someone who has stopped taking the miracle for granted. This is the life the journey was always pointing toward. Not a life of continuous peak experiences, not a life exempt from difficulty or loss, or the full range of what it means to be human in a world that is beautiful and brutal and endlessly surprising in both directions, but a life of genuine presence, of honest engagement, of the particular kind of joy that does not depend on circumstances remaining favorable, because it is not a reaction to circumstances. It is the natural expression of a consciousness that has found its own ground and stands on it, steadily, freely, with the unshakable equanimity of something that has been tested and has held. You will forget this. That is not a pessimistic prediction. It is an honest acknowledgement of the nature of human consciousness in its current form. There will be mornings when the basement will feel very real and very immediate and very much like the whole story. There will be days when the warrior's exhaustion returns, or the seeker's restlessness reasserts itself, or the shadow rises with surprising force. There will be moments when everything explored here feels distant, like something that happened to a different version of you in a different context that no longer feels accessible. In those moments, do not add judgment to the experience. Do not compound the contraction with the story that contraction means failure. Simply remember, not with effort,
not with the desperate reaching of someone trying to recover a state that has been lost, but with the gentle, practiced, increasingly natural act of returning attention to the ground, to the breath, to the simple fact of awareness, to the sky beneath the weather. One breath, one moment of genuine noticing, one honest recognition of where the attention has gone, and the compassionate, non-dramatic act of returning it to the present. This is the entire practice, distilled to its irreducible essence, not because everything else that was offered was unnecessary, but because everything else was in service of this, the capacity to return, again and again, without self-punishment, without the dramatic narrative of falling and rising, with simply the quiet, faithful, increasingly effortless recognition that the ground is here, it was always here, and returning to it is not a failure recovered from, but a practice deepened. The world needs what becomes available when a human being genuinely inhabits the higher levels of consciousness, not in the grandiose sense of a special mission assigned to the spiritually developed, but in the simple, immediate, daily sense of what becomes possible in every interaction, every relationship, every creative act, every moment of genuine service when the one engaging with it is operating from clarity rather than fear, from love rather than defense, from the creative power of aligned consciousness rather than the exhausting effort of a self trying to force the world into the shape its survival instincts demand. Every person who does this genuine inner work changes the field, not through proclamation, not through the performance of higher consciousness for an audience, but through the quiet, powerful, ultimately irresistible influence of a human being who has become, through patient and honest work, more fully themselves, more fully present, more fully alive to the extraordinary privilege and responsibility of being conscious in a world that contains so much suffering and so much beauty in such intimate proximity. This is the contribution. This is the gift that the journey makes possible. Not in addition to living an ordinary life, but as the ordinary life, transformed by the quality of consciousness brought to it. Go live it, fully, honestly, with the courage to remain awake in the moments that invite sleep, with the compassion to meet yourself and others from the level of the heart rather than the level of the wound, with the creative power of someone who understands that the inner state is the primary creative act and tends it accordingly, with the witness's clarity that allows full engagement without losing the ground, with the wholeness of someone who has turned toward the shadow and found in its integration a depth of authentic humanity that partial self-acceptance could never have produced, and with the quiet, unshakable, ever-deepening recognition of what you actually are beneath every role, every story, every level of consciousness that has been inhabited and transcended and integrated along the way. The awareness that is reading these words right now, the presence that has been present through every moment of this journey, the silence beneath the final sentence, the sky that holds it all. That is you. It was always you, and it is, in every sense that finally matters, enough. It is more than enough. It is everything.